Let's have a little pop quiz to begin with. Approximately how many people live in the world today? Over 6 billion. Of those, how many live on $2 a day or less? What'd you say? 2 billion. About 2 billion live on $2 a day or less. Right? How much is a good cup, a good latte from a large one from Starbucks? More than $2. Right. So, and then I'm not an economist by training, but I have learned what it means to be poor, to be really poor, to be in poverty. It means some very basic things. It means, number one, that you're always hungry. Have you ever been really hungry? Anybody here? I mean, opposed to saying, man, I'm starving. It's almost lunchtime. You're always hungry. You're a mother and you have 4 children. You have enough food to feed 2 of them. Which 2 are you going to feed? That's a good MBA question. How are you going to optimize that? Women in the group. Which 2 of your 4 children are you going to feed if you only have enough food for 2? The youngest? The smartest? The strongest? The boys? Okay. Who thinks they know what the right answer is? Well, you don't feed just 2. You split it and you feed all 4 of them because you're always hungry. Right. You don't starve the other 2. So you're always hungry. You have inadequate shelter. When you have inadequate shelter and the rains come, which they almost always do, your shelter leaks. It may not be really cold out, but it might be depending on where you live. But it introduces all kinds of germs and bugs, and you get wet. You have inadequate clothing. You also have no savings because you have no money. So you're unable to have money saved up to buy medicine for when your babies and children invariably get sick. So then what happens to them? They can die from things that most of us would just take for granted. We'd run down to the store and just get something, not even see a doctor. And last but not least, and it took me a little while to figure this one out, is that your children typically aren't getting educated, even though education is available throughout the world. They're not getting educated for a couple very basic, simple reasons. One is that perhaps you weren't educated, so you don't value it. Second is that you have 3 or 4 or 5 kids, so the older kids have to take care of the younger kids while you do some type of menial labor. So they're your built-in babysitters. The third is school uniform. The schools are free, but the school uniform costs $5. This is a trick all around the world. You don't have $5. So for the lack of a $5 uniform, your children don't go to school, which is just an absolute tragedy. If your children go to school, if they can get 8 to 10 years of education, they will be able to read, do basic arithmetic, and have somewhat of a worldview. And the time-tested proof here is that they will refuse to have the life that you have. So a basic education breaks the multi-generational cycle of poverty. Pretty amazing, pretty simple. But also quite extraordinary is around the world, kids aren't getting educated, so they are relegated to repeat the cycle that their parents, grandparents, and so forth have been in. How did I get involved in this kind of work? Because when I was sitting where you were, I was typically sitting in the back row, eating and reading a daily. And I'm surprised none of you are reading a daily. I would always have one. Sitting in the front row in my section was a peer of mine named Steve Ballmer. Difference in personalities is that I'd be back there reading the daily and occasionally looking up in case something interesting might have been said. He'd be down here in the front row on the edge of his seat, getting ready to open every case with his arm out like this. I can just still see it in my mind's eye. And a very different approach to where our lives have gone. But I assumed when I was sitting where you were that I would be a captain of industry. It was a fait accompli. It was just a question of industry finding me, and then I would be anointed captain. And I had a fascinating business career. I got unceremoniously, I had to leave Microsoft at the end of 1999 due to illness and fatigue. Yes, they were sick and tired of me. And it was actually somewhat mutual, so we left on good terms. And but it was painful. But about a year before that, I got an email early one morning from a woman who was off in a product support group way down here, down many levels in the company. And the email went something like this. I've invited this man to Microsoft, and I told him if he came, I could get him to meet with executives. And he's here in my office right now, and I've blown it. I haven't arranged any meetings. No one will meet with him. Could you please meet with him today? And I didn't know who this employee was. She wasn't in a group that I managed or anything. So I got out my business card and looked at it quickly, and it said Vice President of Human Resources. And I believe that that job title at Microsoft meant that I was the one person in the company paid to be nice. So and I looked at my schedule, and I surprisingly had an open hour, which never happened on my calendar. I think it was like at 10 o'clock that morning, so the only appropriate response was, sure, bring him over, whoever he is. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know who this guy was that she'd brought to town, but I can be nice to anybody for an hour. So she brings this man over, sits him down, and he introduces himself as Mohammed Yunus from the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. And some of you are going, wow. I went, so what? Now, if you don't know that name, Mohammed Yunus is the founder of the Grameen Bank and considered one of the fathers of microfinance. And he was just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last Saturday. Quite remarkable that it wasn't the Nobel Prize for what? Economics, right. Yeah. And they gave him the right prize. They gave him the Peace Prize, and hopefully we'll talk about that in a few minutes as to why I think that was so significant. But this man was sitting there. I'd never heard of Mohammed Yunus. I'd never heard of Grameen. And the only thing in my generation that I'd heard of related to Bangladesh was George Harrison from the Beatles had once had an album or something from Bangladesh. And I'm not sure I could find it on a map, but something about music rang in my mind. This man was obviously not a musician. But he sits down and starts talking to me about what he's doing using basic tools of capitalism and free market economics to work with the poorest people on earth, not a handout, but an actual financial transaction. And then he went on to tell me, I thought that was intriguing, but then he went on to tell me something that I found fascinating because I have an engineering background as well as a business background, and that is that he was now in 40,000 villages in Bangladesh. Quick, how many towns and cities can you name in America? You know, you'll peter out after about 43 or something. He was in 40,000 villages with a system that had been replicated and cookie-cuttered. He had created the McDonald's of microfinance and was able to expand it indefinitely. At the time, he was working with 2.5 million women on a weekly basis. I found that all in and of itself fascinating to me, that he'd been able to figure out this system and then replicate it. So it wasn't just a kind of a mom-and-pop NGO type of activity. So I filed that away, and then as soon as I left Microsoft about a year later, I got a hold of a group called Accion, which is co-headquartered in Washington, D.C. and Boston. And they've been doing microfinance in Latin America for about 30 years. And I wanted to go see something. And Latin America is a lot closer than Bangladesh, so I asked them if I could go see one of their projects. And nobody ever calls a microfinance intermediary and saying, can I come and see something? So I didn't realize how unusual my phone call was. And they said, absolutely, let's go to Bolivia. Bolivia is one of the 2 or 3 countries where microfinance got started in the mid-'70s. If you were a country that had the letter B, you had a good chance of having microfinance in the mid-'70s. For real, it was Brazil, Bolivia, and Bangladesh. Not Botswana, I don't know why. They missed out. So we went to, this was in 99, we went down to La Paz, Bolivia, and saw a great organization called Banco Sol, which is one of the largest banks now in Bolivia, but it caters just to the poor. And it had transformed itself from being an NGO or nonprofit to a licensed financial institution, which was quite remarkable. And they were borrowing money from other banks and then relending it to the poor, and they had a profitable business going on. That was fascinating to watch that. I came home from that, and the phone rang again one day, and it was I actually got 2 phone calls from 2 people I'd never heard of before, both in Utah. And they said, we've heard you're interested in poverty stuff, and we're going to have a brainstorming session with a group of business leaders. Would you like to come and brainstorm with us? Because we want to do something. And the first time I got the phone call, I said, wow, that's weird. How did this guy know about me? I wrote down his name, but I didn't commit anything. The next day, I get a phone call from another guy who's going to be in the same meeting, not knowing that the first guy called me. Neither one of them knew me, but they'd heard of me for some reason, and he said the same thing. So I just thought, this is too weird. I have to go. And that's how I responded to it. So I went to this meeting. In the meeting, I happened to find a friend that I'd met 15 years ago who I'd become a lifetime friend with, who I hadn't seen for about 15 years. And he was in this meeting. He was from Connecticut. and he was one of the managing partners at Bain Capital. So I thought, this is too unusual that all these things are serendipitously happening. So we sat around and brainstormed for about 6 months and came up with the world's first online dating system for families who wanted to get involved in humanitarian work around the world. Had nothing to do with what we're doing today. And it was a really interesting idea. We created a very interesting website where, let's say, you individually or your family and your brothers and sisters and so forth, you go to the website and you filled out a profile, just like you want an online date. But this profile was, where do you want to do a project in the world? And you'd pick the country. And then the profile would ask you, what type of work do you want to do? Do you want to work in education, literacy, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, poverty alleviation, environment? You'd pick your topic issue. And then you'd indicate what you have to bring to the party. I have money, how much? I have expertise, what kind? I have just my own energy. I'll mobilize some other people. And you'd fill that out, and then you'd hit the button that says match me. And the back end of our database was populated with several thousand profiles filled out by NGOs from around the world who readily filled out this profile for us. And we started getting hits. And people started finding projects that they and their family could get involved in some way or another. And then we got a phone call one morning from somebody, some good family, saying, we're sitting here, we're about ready to seal the envelope with a check for $5,000 to this organization in Tanzania. And we just have one question. What would that question be? The question, close to that question was, can you vouch for this organization? What was our answer? No. This is the internet. we don't know who they are. And then we got very uncomfortable after that phone call. So we realized we'd have to create an army of people that could somehow go out and vouch for these organizations with some standard. And we didn't have money to do that. So what do you think we did? Shut it down. We just shut the site down. And that's the only thing we could do morally. So we regrouped. Since I'd met Eunice, and another guy on our board had also met him one time, we got an invitation to go visit him in Bangladesh. And we spent 5 days, not in a PR kind of a trip, but a behind-the-scenes trip, where we were there in his main office in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and then out in a bunch of villages. And they allowed us to understand microfinance unvarnished. The stuff, in fact, all of their things that the mistakes Grameen had made over the last 25 years, the things they wish they could have done better. And they were just teaching us everything, and it was so amazing. We saw Eunice every day. The last day that we were there was quite interesting. We knew that he was going to spend about 3 or 4 hours with us by himself. So I cooked up this idea in my mind. He comes into this conference room. Now, it's kind of interesting, just as an aside. He has a big conference room with a big conference table. And every meeting you have with him, and this was in the year 2000, every meeting you had with him was filmed. And I don't know what that was for, just in case he said something brilliant, or we said something brilliant, or they could capture it, so maybe someday he'd get the Nobel Prize. And every place you sat had a microphone. And this was in Bangladesh at a conference table. It was very unusual. So we're sitting there being filmed as we just had our regular meeting. But the meeting started out, and I said to Eunice, I said, I'd like you to play a role-play game with us today. And he kind of looked at me curiously, and he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like you to take off your hat from running Grameen, and instead I'd like you to pretend that we represent a consortium from the World Bank, CGAP, the United Nations, a bunch of other groups like that, and we're here to hire you. And we want you to come to work for us in New York with an unlimited budget. And we want you to tell us what you would do based on what you've learned now from 25 years at Grameen. We want you to go worldwide with this work. We want to understand how you would set that up, how you would fund it, how you'd think about it. And I was amazed. I didn't know if he'd go along with this or not. It was just some wild idea I had. My friends with me on the trip had no idea what I was talking about. And he just took the bait, and it was fascinating. He says, all right, let's get going. And we all got out our notepads. And for the next 4 hours, he created a business plan for a worldwide organization that would accelerate the growth of microfinance around the world. It isn't quite what Unitus is doing, but it opened up a whole bunch of thinking for us, and it was absolutely fascinating. And his mind was like a traditional old-fashioned outline that you did in the 6th grade, where you started with Roman numeral 1, and then big A, big B, little a, and so forth. And we were just kind of ratcheting down, and each time we got through with a Roman numeral, I had to very quickly figure out what the next question to ask him was, because this was all being done real time. We got back from that meeting, and then I went to a conference in New York, sponsored by CGAP. CGAP is this wonderful organization. If you don't know them, make sure you find their website, cgap.com or org. Anybody know? I think it's .com. The consultative group for something against or to alleviate poverty. And they're a great kind of a think tank. And they had a conference. I went to the conference. I don't do well in conferences. I kind of have the attention span of a fruit fly. But I knew I had to hang through this one. And it was the last speaker. Her name was Elizabeth Littlefield. She still runs CGAP, a very knowledgeable woman about microfinance and poverty. And she was going through this set of PowerPoint slides. And she showed this large group of people going through these slides. And all of a sudden, she had this slide up on the screen. And it was a true aha moment. I call it the slide that changed my life. And it was a pie chart. I've seen lots of pie charts. This is a pie chart that showed the structure of the microfinance industry. It indicated at the time that there were about 3,000 active microfinance institutions in the world. A microfinance institution, or MFI, is a group formed for the purpose of making microfinance loans to men or women, collecting the loans and helping them move along in their lives. So the slide showed there were about 3,000 of them. Then it started dividing up the industry. It showed that 70% of those 3,000 were serving 2,500 clients or less. So picture in your mind a microfinance institution working with about 2,500 women, sometimes men or less. 70% of the industry is that size. So that's kind of small operations. When you think about 2 billion people living on $2 a day or less, and most microfinance organizations are these mom and pop groups serving 2,000 to 2,500 clients. So, and then it showed a smaller slice and and the tiniest slice was 2% of the microfinance institutions in the world serve 100,000 clients or more. Now I looked at this slide and I said something's wrong, not with the slide, but with the structure of the industry. It's approximately a 25-year-old industry then. And what do you think I thought was wrong with the industry? Pardon me? The structural problem I saw was that after 25, 30 years, if you're in an industry where your service works, there should be a larger number of large players. Now, if that little wedge that said that 2% of the institutions, if that had been 0% had gotten big, then I wouldn't have had a problem with the slide, because it would indicate that for some reason these kinds of organizations can only become medium-sized at best, and that's kind of it. But some of these had gotten really big. Grameen was working with 2.5 million women. BRAC, 3 million. ASHA, 3 million. Comportamos, 300,000 at the time. And it showed me that you could scale this industry. But it isn't scaling. That's what got me all excited. Something's broken in this industry. Groups are going out trying to deliver this great poverty alleviation tool to poor women, and they're stuck small. There must be artificial impediments that are stopping groups from getting big. And that became an incredibly challenging idea to me. And I had this privilege of working at both Apple and Microsoft, where you did nothing but think big and think outside the lines. And the idea of growing 40% a year in terms of headcount, profits, revenue, etc., every year was just the way you did business. It didn't seem to be unusually fast. You got used to that, and you could do it in a controlled way. So I thought, my goodness, hasn't anyone ever looked at this slide before? Yeah, I think a lot of people had, but not with the business point of view and the experiences that I had. So I went back to this board of this online dating, now defunct online humanitarian dating service, and said, look, I'm willing to step up to be chairman of what we called Unitus, but I'm going to move it. It was located in Utah. I will move it to Seattle, where I live, and I'll put in $1 million a year of my own money so that we can start hiring some brilliant people and put together some very good marketing collateral and become the world's first microfinance accelerator. And the board thought that sounded good, but they had one question. The question was, what's a microfinance accelerator? No one. And that was a term that came to me as I studied the situation. The idea was, let's create a specialized organization, unlike any group that's out there, that will go after these structural issues in this industry and see if we can't figure out what they are and unlock them. And then demonstrate, we'll do it for a group of microfinance institutions that we'll partner with, but we'll demonstrate to the industry that this can be done repetitively and easily, and there's no secret sauce. If you can find the right kind of microfinance group You can unlock these constraints for growth. Let's go do it. Then I get the phone rang again. And because I didn't want to run this myself, I was kind of done with the running thing part of my life. And a friend said, a different friend who wasn't involved, he said, hey, I heard that you've done this Unitus thing, and a young man that I know has just graduated from Harvard's Kennedy School with a master's degree in international development, and he spent, in between his undergraduate and graduate years, he was down in Chiapas, Mexico, creating his own microfinance organization. He might be perfect for you. Huh. Wow. Wasn't that an amazing phone call? So I go interview this guy who's just graduating named Jeff Davis, and it was like he walked out of central casting for this job. He felt like he'd been called to this job. So I hired him on the spot, and Jeff's now our president and CEO and doing a wonderful job. Jeff had the academic background to understand more about the economics of poverty, and I just had kind of the gut feel for it. And together we studied the industry, and we identified two major constraints that prevent MFIs from growing. And now, you don't have to be a brain surgeon, but it took a little while to figure this out. The first is, the reason most MFIs are stuck small is that they don't have the internal capacity, and the for-profit term would be infrastructure skills, to know how to get big. They just don't know how to do it. You start out with a really good person, oftentimes homegrown in their country, like Ecuador, and they learn about microfinance some way or another, and they go and raise some money. Maybe they come up to America, and they talk to some church groups or some social groups or some friends of family or whatever, and they raise, I don't know, $200,000. That would be a ton of money to raise. It really would in this line of work. You go back to Ecuador, you say, let's give on average starting loans of $100. Okay? How many loans can you make if you have $200,000? No calculators. 2,000. You make 2,000 loans. What's the average size of an MFI? 2,000 to 2,500. So the guy raises the money, or the woman raises the money, goes down to Ecuador, creates a headquarters and maybe 2 or 3 branch offices, and starts lending the money, running a very nice microfinance organization. But now, how do we scale beyond that? How do I think about scaling? So I'm lacking. I don't know how to put in an IT system. I'm doing it all on Excel, which works just fine. But I don't have any skills in terms of hiring middle management. I don't even think that way. And I don't realize that this organization that I've developed is serving 2,000 women, that my geographic area could accommodate 50,000. Because I'm not doing any type of demand studies. I'm doing this all organically and pushing it up. So there's internal capacity constraints in terms of knowing how to build IT systems, HR systems, basic hiring practices, performance practices, and so forth. And scaling, the actual physical act of how do I go from 4 branch offices to 40 to 400. And that's an interesting way to think about scaling, because you've got to create branch offices. And there's an order of magnitude in increase in complexity as you go from 4 to 40 to 400 to 4,000 to Eunice at 40,000 when I met him. You also need, second constraint, money. Where do I get money? You go over to the local bank, you're an NGO, and you say, hey, look, I'm lending to 2,000 women here, and I raised $200,000. Would you give me a line of credit for another $200,000? Well, the bank says, let's see your income statement, your balance sheet. And the bank just laughs at them. Says, you're a nonprofit, you have no equity, you have all of your loans are unsecured, and you're tiny. No way, I can't do that. So you're stuck small. So once we understood that, our mission became very, very clear. We had to go and help MFIs improve their internal capacity skills and find capital for them. What model should we use? We decided to use a model that's used in venture capital for selection. Because there are 3,000, and let's take that 70% wedge, there's 2,100 potential candidates for us. That's a lot. And the thinking was, there's got to be some low-hanging fruit there. So even though we think we had a very sound idea, let's make sure we're successful right off the bat. So let's go pick some that are just ripe for scaling. So we created initially 60 variables that we use to do due diligence on MFIs around the world. And we'd send out some surveys. People would send us in their information. So we do something we call desk due diligence, which is up in Seattle. And then if we find a group that we think looks very compelling, we'd hit the road and go visit them. And we'd go through their books, we'd talk to their management, we'd go visit their clients, we'd talk to people who left their program, just like a venture capitalist go and look at a business plan and then try to figure out if the plan made sense or not. We've become exceptionally good at this, at the selection process. We're the only group we know of in the world that does this. in terms of carefully selecting MFIs to work with. Most historic groups will pick an area, Guatemala, India, someplace, the Mideast, and that's all a great thing to do. And then they'll just go in there with a bunch of money and start indiscriminately helping a bunch of microfinance groups. That's okay, but it's not very leveraged. And we're all about leverage in terms of trying to reach the greatest number of people with the least amount of overall effort, because we lack resources ourselves. In the first, in years 2004 and 2005, we looked at over 200 opportunities for microfinance partnerships, and we picked 5. That means we said no to 195 opportunities. Highly selective. As a result, we're able to find groups that are eager and capable of taking our consulting advice. Then we started hiring consultants who have either McKinsey or Monitor type backgrounds, and for some reason want to work for $75,000, $80,000 a year, or they have banking backgrounds or legal backgrounds. We have an extraordinary staff of highly talented people who typically you'd find here in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street or someplace else, very, very bright. Average age, 28 to 35 would be our average age. And we have now a staff of about 35 people, 25 up in Seattle and 10 in India. And I'll talk about that for a moment. So we started going around and finding groups to work with, and we found that our ideas made a ton of sense. We found that it was more complex. We found that there's no such thing as a cookie-cutter MFI, and that we have to be pretty fast on our feet, and we also have to create great relationships with the CEO and the senior management team. We don't take over these organizations. If this was a car, we sit in the back seat of the car, and we let the CEO drive the car, and his staff sit in the front seat. But we do get a big roll of duct tape out, and we duct tape the CEO's foot to the gas pedal. Intentionally. And we say, let's see how fast we can help you grow. The first thing we do is we say, let's see what your business plan looks like for the next few years. And they all have plans. These are business-oriented people, generally, in some way or another. And they might have a growth curve that looks like this. They're at 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 clients, and they're planning on growing, but maybe up to 12,000 clients in 5 years. And here's the first exercise we do. We put our finger on the pivot point here, and we just go, and we just tip it up. We say, how about 90,000 instead of 12,000? And they just gasp. And we say, well, we look at your surrounding area, and we know you can easily accommodate that. And then we say, what would it take? Then it becomes really fun. Because they've never been allowed to think this way, because they've always been so constrained by resources that they could never think big like this. And then marvelous things happen. Usually what happens is, by the time we get done with 3 or 4 years, from the 12,000 to what we guessed, 90,000, they're like up here. They outstrip us completely. I just got back from Calcutta, where I spent last week with a group of potential donors. We have 7 partners now in India, which is the best place in the world right now to be doing this kind of work. And we just kind of lucked into that. We have this partner named Bandhan, B-A-N-D-H-A-N, bandhanmf.com if you want to go to their website, run by a remarkable man named Mr. Ghosh, who'd spent 14 years in Bangladesh learning about microfinance. So he's about my age, came back to his home area of Calcutta and started this up 5 years ago with 0 clients. He now has, after really 4 years of doing this, 300,000 clients in the slums and in the surrounding rural villages of Calcutta. He's adding 30,000 new clients per month. We don't know of any organization in the world that's growing as rapidly in terms of adding such a high percentage to his current installed base as he is. Currently, he has 909 employees, full-time employees. This is not a mom-and-pop operation. He has a business plan, and he has a rigor, very much like what Unitus had when I met him, of being able to scale this to reach 4 million women by the year 2010, at which time he'll have 12,000 employees. Imagine that. That means he has to have 8 or 9 layers of management, performance review systems, bonus systems, pay scales, a very complex IT system. If you have 4 million women, you are having 50 times 4 million, 200 million transactions per year that you have to track. And you can't do that on Excel. It's a very complicated business, and the transactions are all so small The average loan repayment is $2, $1 to $2 a week. And if you have a cumbersome, expensive transaction processing system, you eat up all of your potential profit just through transaction costs. He's been able to lower his interest rates over the last 18 months from 18% to 15%, now down to 12.5%, and they're looking at going to 10%, which is absolutely remarkable. Typical interest rates in this business mirror what you'd have as a credit card interest rate in the countries that you're in. And part of this is because of the transaction costs associated with this. So he's stripping the costs out of his operations. And when you see a guy like Mr. Ghosh doing what he's doing, and he's unusual, and he's located in one of the poorest, largest cities in the world, so he's kind of like struck gold, so to speak. It's kind of an oxymoron. And you can't do that in all places, but you can see what you can do when you have systems like he has. One of the other big challenges in microfinance is that the industry has been run as a donor-based industry. That means we always have our hand out, and we're saying, give us, this industry, money so we can run this industry. But wait a minute. Aren't we in the industry of helping men and women around the world become economically self-sufficient through financial services? Yeah. Well, isn't there a way that the organizations that are providing these financial services, shouldn't they become self-sufficient themselves? Or why should they remain charities? Who banks locally with Wells Fargo? Anybody? Okay, have they called you at any time in the last 3 weeks asking you for a donation to help run the bank? Not a donation for some charity, but to help run the bank, to pay for the teller. Not recently, no. And if they did, your response would be? Yeah, you're very polite. Let's hear another response to that. You'd say, now let me get this straight. You want me to give you a donation to run your bank? That sounds kind of wild. But that's what a microfinance institution is. It's a bank that's lending to the poor. Could we take these nonprofit institutions, also called NGOs when you're in the developing world, and transform them from a nonprofit structure to a for-profit structure? Theoretically, yeah. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit in banking, and some of you hopefully have taken some finance and banking classes, is what's the idea of a bank? A bank gets equity on its balance sheet, and then they are able to leverage that equity. 2 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1. And you go to other banks and you borrow money against your equity. If you're a nonprofit, you have no equity on your balance sheet. There's no such thing. So, a few years ago, some innovators started trying this idea out, very randomly, non-selectively, and it didn't get much attention. We looked at that and we said, man, that's the next thing you have to do. You have to take a microfinance institution and go through a process called transformation, where they become a licensed financial institution in the country that they operate in. You don't change their mission, you don't change their focus, you just change their legal structure. And then once you change their legal structure, they need equity investments, just like here in Silicon Valley in startups. For those of you who wish you'd had an equity investment in YouTube, I can offer you some nice MFIs in India to look at as alternatives, where we are making equity investments in organizations that have transformed themselves into licensed financial institutions now, and we're able to get in there pretty cheap, we think. Because they're at the front end of a growth curve. It looks like this. You're Mr. Ghosh now with 300,000 clients going to 12 million clients. Just think what the book value of your organization is going to be 5, 6, 7 years from now. Now, what he does when he gets that equity investment is he goes to a local bank. In India, you go to ICICI. That's not a farm bank. It's not EIEIO. It's a very aggressive bank in India that's looking for ways of financing the microfinance industry. And they'll look at Mr. Ghosh's balance sheet, and they'll give him 5 to 1, 10 to 1 leverage against his equity. So if we can put in $2 million of equity, he might be able to get up to a $20 million line of credit. That's very smart. Because he can borrow that money from the bank at this interest rate, lend it at this interest rate, pays all his bills on the spread, typical banking model. That's why we don't give donations to Wells Fargo, because that's how their model works. If he was going to try to raise $20 million in donations, guess what? He couldn't do it. We thought when we started this, we thought erroneously 5 years ago that we would be a donor-based organization. We thought, and I thought particularly, that I could go out, because I'm pretty good at presentations and I'm very passionate and believe in what I'm doing, that I could approach a very broad network of friends introduce them to microfinance because they hadn't heard of it before, but I knew as soon as they heard of it, the money would just start rolling in. No, it doesn't. Now, hopefully, your generation will understand this and get more excited about it and realize that it's one of the greatest forms of combinations of charity, philanthropy, social empowerment, and all the great benefits that come from it. My generation doesn't get it very easily, and they're very tight. Couple dynamics at place. Only 2% of all U.S. philanthropy goes outside of the U.S. We are the most generous country in the world in terms of philanthropy, by far, on a per capita basis. But only 2% of our philanthropy goes outside. Now, that used to bug me, but then I got over the emotional part of it, and it's easy. We're very comfortable living within our own backyard, metaphorically, and funding our schools, our churches, our hospitals, the arts, and local programs, of course, because that's where we live. The challenge for raising money in this industry is that we have to make it relevant. That's what I've learned. It's kind of marketing 101, really, when you're trying to convince somebody that they need your product. You've got to make it relevant in their lives. How do I make it relevant that the woman that I was visiting with last week, a number of women in little tiny houses in the slums of Calcutta and these villages, is somehow relevant to you? That's a tough one. I can show you some incredible pictures if we had more time on my laptop of these photos, and particularly the women. You'd probably start crying. I mean it. In terms of, I'd tell you their stories, I'd tell you the sweet part of the stories, I'd tell you the successes they're having. Your hearts will melt. And maybe some of you men might actually shed a little tear, but you'd be very careful about that, wouldn't you? And then you'd say, wow, that's so cool that you're doing this. And then, the bell rings, and it's time for your next class. And the half-life of your feeling is remarkably short. And if you bring back the memory, your memory is not going to be a guilt memory that, oh, dang, I knew I really got to give them money. Instead, your memory is, wow, that Mike Murray, that Unitus, that's so cool. I'm sure glad I got to meet him. Wrong reaction. So it's been very interesting for us and for the industry. I was on the board of Axion for 6 years and saw the same challenges they had in terms of fundraising. Now, we have to have funds because that's how we pay for our staff of 35. We are not a financial institution. We are this helping organization that goes out and helps these microfinance groups have radical scaling and radical acceleration. We want to demonstrate this, and we're brand new at what we're doing. We have 10 partners around the world right now. Partners means MFIs that we work with. We can add 3 or 4 a year. About 70% of our work is in India because the opportunity is so great. About 1/3 of the world's clients for microfinance right now are in India that you can reach the way we do through microfinance. China would skew that, but China's off the map right now because you can't commercialize microfinance in China. You can't scale it yet. And there's a whole bunch of organizations just kind of hovering on the border of China waiting to come in at the right time, but there's too many iffy things there. So India represents a huge opportunity. The density of poverty is tremendous. There's some very well-run smaller organizations, and we didn't know that until we got over there about 3 years ago and did our first partnership. And we just thought, oh my goodness, this is like putting a knife through soft butter. And we set up a shop, and we now have the largest network of microfinance groups in India of anybody. Kind of interesting. We never knew that would happen to us. But our way that we fund ourselves is purely through donations. And it's interesting, we get, 5 or 6 a day off from our website where random people read about us. We don't know who they are, and they send in $25, and we love that. And I'd love to make that, 100 a day that way. We also have gotten some great help from Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. Pierre is a very rabid, and I wish it was infected, but a rabid free market guy who loves the idea of free market economics as a way of solving a lot of the world's problems. So he's provided us with a large amount of operational funding. My family foundation does, our board does. And then there's a lot of people who give $100, $1,000, $10,000, and you're just constantly working on it. We are capacity constrained as an organization. We have 10 partners now. We could easily have 30 partners around the world. But we have to service them because we need the consulting skills to go and help them scale their operations and bring in more capital. And so it's just pure manpower constraints. So the more money we can raise, the more people we can hire, and the more work we can do. We have a formula that works, and we can just keep doing it for the next, kind of into the foreseeable future, as far as we can tell. At some point in time, it would be wonderful to close down Unitus. Why? So I can golf more? What would be the end game here? What's the exit strategy? Pardon?
The MFIs do it themselves anyway.
Yes, they start scaling themselves, but how are they going to then find the capital? What about the commercial markets?
They realize that it's a profitable investment.
Yes, and that's happening. And over the last 24 months, there's been almost a tipping point. We're almost ready to say that, where I don't know, there's 5 or 6 large banks in the world that are creating initiatives, aggressive initiatives to get into microfinance. And that's very exciting. They are seeing that this is a legitimate asset class. And as soon as this becomes a legitimate asset class and the capital markets come to bear, then there is essentially unlimited capital available for lending, for on lending to poor people. And then the role for intermediaries like ourselves changes dramatically. We have no desire to be around 50 years from now with 50 MFIs in our network, and we kind of tell you about our legacy projects. That's not victory. Victory is when the capital markets come down, and this just becomes a matter-of-fact business where banks are funding MFIs, where MFIs are, in order to be eligible for bank, your point, I think, MFIs, in order to be eligible, they got to start looking good. So they got to grow themselves up. They got to have solid business plans. They got to look around and see how these other guys got the funding, and they'll start making it happen. There's 3 or 4 good IT in this industry. It's interesting. Your accounting system is called an MIS system, which is a term from way, way, way back, but that's held on in the microfinance industry. So you need a really good MIS system, but there's 2 or 3 software companies that are creating large standardized products in that realm. So we see a world where it becomes commercialized, where capital is readily available, and we also are not worried by the potential for mission drift. The critics will say, once the capital markets come to bear and this becomes an overly commercialized market, all the MFIs are going to move up market. Why give out 1,000 $100 loans and all the hassle it is of servicing those, where you could give out one $100,000 loan or one $1 million loan? Well, the reason is that this is your competence. This is what you're really good at, and you can make money doing it. You can help the poor, and you can also, by properly taking care of your spread here from the money going in, money going out, you can make money. You can pay your salaries, and you can have a nice return. We launched the Unitus Equity Fund in January. Unitus is a nonprofit institution, but we created a for-profit organization called the Unitus Equity Fund, licensed in the Cayman Islands. And no, it's actually legitimate. And since January, we've raised around $10.5 million. Now, by venture funds or private equity fund numbers, that's tiny. For what we're doing, it's huge. These were not donations. These are social investors who have invested in this fund, knowing that we're going to take the money and make equity investments in small microfinance groups around the world who've made this transformation from nonprofit to for-profit. And they believe that there's an opportunity to make a profit doing this. There's one huge unknown in this equation, this particular equation. Any guess of what that is? Exits. There are no known exits. Would you invest in a Silicon Valley startup if there was no known exit? No, you never would. And the typical exits are IPOs or you sell yourself to Google, the 2 paths right now. So we have to now be a market maker, and we have to create exits. So we either have to create the public market, the IPO market for MFIs, or we go around and convincing larger banks that makes a ton of sense for them to buy this organization that focuses on the poor, so the poor at the bottom of the pyramid, and they can get access to a whole bunch of new retail customers that eventually are going to start moving up economically. And we'll need savings accounts, we'll need ATMs, we'll want mortgages, we'll want insurance products, and so forth. That's more likely. That's what we see happening.